Hello, I'm Logan.
And I'm Lexi.
And this is Pride and Prejudice, the podcast talking all things pride, but mainly we're talking about the T in LGBT. Okay, this episode we're talking about something that the internet has very appropriately named neuroqueerness. This is sort of the crossover between neurodivergence and being part of the LGBT community. In an earlier episode, we spoke about common myths and misinformation, and in this episode, we're going to talk about some interesting facts. So, the crossover between neurodivergence and being in the LGBT community. So, we mentioned at the beginning that both Lexi and I are autistic and also in the community. What do you know about the crossover?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think there are a lot of studies into it, but generally it seems like a much higher proportion of the autistic population in particular are also, somewhere in the queer umbrella. There are a lot more trans autistic people than there are trans neurotypical people, which is pretty interesting, I think. We don't know the exact reasons, but I think that part of it is our autism kind of allows us to almost question social norms and say, if I were neurotypical, I might not pick up so easily or accept that I'm transgender, for example. But because I'm autistic, I kind of never really fit in anyway, so I was kind of like, yeah, I'm trans, so what? It was just a part of me.
Yeah, it might not be the case statistically that autistic people are more likely to be trans. It might just be the case that the statistics are higher because autistic people are more likely to come out as trans as opposed to neurotypical people. So that is very interesting. And also, this isn't the case for everyone, but it's certainly the case for me. I can't lie. I find it incredibly difficult too. So I couldn't really be in the closet because I made it kind of incredibly obvious to everyone around me that, people in my life who are also trans kind of knew as well. Lexi's nodding. You can't see, but Lexi's nodding. She knew, and Mum knew, because I'm not very good at hiding it. But you shouldn't have to hide it. But what I'm saying is, staying in the club. It already takes so much effort to mask as an autistic person. To also mask your gender identity was just too difficult a task for me to do. I had to come out, and maybe that might be the case for other people, which could be a positive thing. I believe it always should be a positive thing, but it's not always great if your family isn't supportive.
I think speaking of even something like coming out is interesting how they're kind of parallels. Certainly, I never needed to come out to my parents as autistic, but after I was diagnosed, I sort of went through the process of, telling other people in my life that I was autistic. And it's still kind of that question of like, when should, at what point in a conversation or relationship with someone do you disclose, oh, I'm autistic, by the way? And it's very similar to being like, oh, by the way, I'm transgender, or I'm asexual in my case. And I never really thought of that before, but there's kind of parallels in the way it shapes your identity.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Because I find that, as I mentioned before, I don't tell people that I'm trans because I'm worried about... people I don't know. I don't tell new people that I'm trans because you don't always know who is a safe person to come out to. But I did make a friend a few months ago who thought I was a cis guy. And then sort of the conversation led into me talking about surgery. And he was curious about what surgery I was talking about, and me being autistic, I was like, yeah, it's top surgery. And he was like, hang on a minute. Wait a second. And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't tell you I was trans, did I? And then I sort of have that initial panic of, oh crap, am I going to lose a friend now? But luckily he was cool with it. But it's just sort of funny, not always, but can be funny getting into situations like that. um what people tend to forget is that scientific research changes all the time. We used to think the earth is flat. Some people still do, but it doesn't make it a scientific fact. And the same has kind of happened with new research on gender and gender as a spectrum. So it's kind of come out in recent scientific studies that gender is a spectrum and not sort of just black and white like they initially thought it might be.
So certainly there's kind of the people with a very basic knowledge of biology might say, oh, there's only two genders, there's only two sexes, when really it's way more complicated than that, and that's backed up by science. You see it in nature, you see it in everyday people, not just trans people, intersex people as well.
Might also want to mention chromosomes, because a lot of arguments that uninformed transphobes will use is, oh, you have these chromosomes, which makes you this thing. Which, if they knew anything about how actual chromosomes work, that's not always the case. Intersex people are a thing. And also, not every male or female has XX or XY chromosomes. Some people have irregular chromosomes and they don't know about it, because you would have to get that tested to find out. But you're not talking to a petri dish. You're talking to a person. It doesn't matter what chromosomes they have. Which also sort of brings us onto the topic about sex characteristics, because I was always under the impression that you can't change your sex, which is true to an extent, but characteristics kind of comes in two forms, that being the physical representation of sort of how you look, how you act, or how you dress, and also the biological elements that might change when you transition.
Yeah, so I think there is an argument to be said for something like the term transsexual, although it still sounds like a sexuality, so I wouldn't use it. But in terms of kind of the medical definition of it being about sex, because in a way, particularly if it's a medical transition, you are in a way transitioning from one sex to another in terms of these sexual characteristics, because sex as a biological thing, not talking about intercourse, but sex is a combination of different characteristics, and you don't necessarily have to have all of them. You can have a mixture of them. It doesn't mean people fit neatly into two boxes.
So sexual characteristics. Sex characteristics are something that can change once you are on hormone replacement therapy, as it has done for me. For example, as you can hear, my voice has dropped. That hasn't been the case since I was a teenager. That's actually happened fairly recently. About probably a year ago. It's still dropping, annoyingly, so I still get voice cracks. But that is a sex characteristic that I have changed about myself. But also other things like facial hair. That wouldn't have been a thing I would have likely had if I didn't go on testosterone. There's also other changes like muscle mass. I've gained more muscle since being on testosterone. I sweat a lot more, annoyingly. It's one of those effects of tea that people don't really talk about. That's really irritating. But now that I've sort of had these hormonal changes, my sex characteristics align a lot more to the male sex than they previously did.
So unfortunately for me, my voice and facial hair don't change on estrogen, but I have had other changes, a lot of them kind of feels subtle at the moment, to me at least. But for me, I had the loss of muscle mass and some fat redistribution and breast growth as well. So it's kind of, well, for both of us, it's kind of what you would go through typically in puberty, except for each of us it's the second puberty. And then, in a way, I mean, this is more contested, but, you know, surgeries can further change your sexual characteristics. Yeah.
So I want to state that neither of us are scientists, nor have we done any gender studies in further education. But if you do want to look further into the science of being transgender, sort of the scientific research behind it, there are loads of sources you can go to. I mentioned earlier Jamie Raines, who was known as Jammy Dodger on YouTube. He has a PhD, and he always cites his sources when he talks about sort of the scientific research behind being trans, and that those videos are pretty easy to find if you're looking for them on his channel. Samantha Lux, someone I mentioned earlier, also cites her sources. She kind of makes a channel, most of the content on her channel was kind of coming back at transphobes, essentially. When transphobes kind of say uninformed things, she kind of makes videos coming back at them, well, saying, well, actually science says this, and here's the source. Jessie Gender on YouTube is also a good place to look for. But yeah, essentially, there is lots of interesting research that has been done and is still going. And just to always keep an open mind about these sorts of things, because science admits when it's wrong. You know, if new studies come out saying that disproves a theory most scientists previously had, they will admit, oh, okay, we were wrong about that, and now this is the new information. But because so many people know the old information, they hyperfixate on that, when really newer studies say something different. You know, that's kind of the interesting thing about science in general. So to end our series of podcasts, I wanted to talk about if someone in your life is trans, you might be wondering how to support them. I think the best thing to do is to listen to them, and if they're not really sure what to do, encourage them to speak to a doctor, encourage them to speak to a therapist. Also look at some of the YouTube channels and books that we've stated. The most important thing really is to call them by their chosen pronouns. I say chosen pronouns, but being trans isn't a choice. But what I mean is the pronouns that they have discovered that works for them. Essentially, it does make a surprising amount of difference in that person's life, and it's, at the end of the day, it's very basic respect that will massively I don't want to say improve their dysphoria, but will sort of massively make a positive difference on their mental health, because being trans is mentally taxing at times, especially if the trans person is going through dysphoria.
But a lot of that is exacerbated by other people, so any support you can give is it really helps.
Mm-hmm. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're unsure about what pronouns they might go by, or if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, just as long as those questions aren't invasive, especially if you don't know the person very well. You know, don't just start off by saying, have you had the surgery? Just think about, would you ask this same question to a cis person? Would you ask someone about their sex life if they weren't part of the LGBT community? But if you're making the effort to try, that already says an incredible amount about you, and you will be making a positive difference in that person's life.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. We've got all the things that we talked about in the description, so you can go and find out more.
If you do have any questions, feel free to comment. But thank you for listening to the two of us ramble. two autistic trans people rambling. It was very fun to record.
Thank you.
And happy Pride Month.
Thanks for listening to the Pride and Prejudice podcast.
And be sure to check out the other episodes.
Bye.
Bye.